clearly it's a circumstance that cost Valtteri dearly and cost the team dearly, and one that we're going to put steps in place to mitigate.
Formula One is the most costly sport globally, and it's clear that making and designing these cars is also much more expensive due to how complex they are, but did you know that a single wheel nut can cost almost £1,000? And according to F1 rules, each car needs 13 sets of tires for a Grand Prix weekend. This means that one Formula One team can spend over £50,000 in a single race weekend. You might be wondering why the cost is so high. Welcome back everyone, in this video we'll delve into the reasons behind this expense. In the past, Formula One wheel nuts weren't as expensive as they are now. There's a long history of gradual improvement that has led to their current high cost. Back in the early days of Formula One, the wheel nuts were put on using hammers. This was because tools like impact guns didn't exist at that time. The only other option was using many studs, which took a lot of time to change. In those days, Formula One cars used a type of single center lock nut with wings on the sides. Some had 2 wings and others had 3. When a car came into the pit lane, the pit crews would bring a mallet to hammer off the nut. Then they would change the wheel and put on a new nut by hammering it in place. The wheel would fit onto pins to prevent it from spinning on the hub. Then the single nut would be tightened to secure the wheel. The mechanics knew it was tight enough when the mallet couldn't tighten the nut any further. By the way, here's an interesting tidbit. Back when Ferrari's F1 cars were using these nuts, they also installed them on their regular road cars. The Ferrari 365 GTB, for instance, actually included a Thor mallet in its toolkit. During the 1950s and 1960s, F1 stuck with these nuts. They generally performed well, but there was a notable issue. You see, when a car applies force to the wheels while braking or accelerating, it creates a twisting effect. When the nut is securely fastened, this isn't a problem. However, even a slight movement of the wheel with each braking or acceleration instance can cause the nut to shift back and forth. This problem becomes worse due to the intense vibrations and the jolting of the car over curbs. As a result, these wheel nuts had a tendency to become loose. Teams found a solution. They used right-handed threads on the left and left-handed threads on the right side of the car. This made the wheels tighten while braking, helping both sides, but the rear faced issues. As the rear wheels both drive and brake, detachment happened due to conflicting directions. After a while, Formula One made a transition to using wheel nuts that had a hexagonal shape on them. They started with steel nuts but eventually switched to aluminum. These types of wheel nuts also have specific features that let a pin be inserted to prevent them from loosening. This effectively solves the issue we talked about earlier. F1 engineers refer to this as a retention system, and they have been refining and perfecting it over the past 15 years. Formula One made advancements in wheel nut technology. They started using wheel nuts with multiple grooves that could quickly fit into a socket. These new nuts had a spline design, which made it less likely for the socket to not fit properly. This was important because, at that time, pit stops in F1 were becoming faster, but the speed was still limited by the time it took to refuel the car. Changing the wheel wasn't the main factor slowing down pit stops. Despite this, there were interesting innovations happening. One of these innovations was the captive wheel nut system. Instead of the mechanic having to take off the nut, place it aside, change the wheel, then thread the nut back on and tighten it, they developed a way to keep the nut attached to the wheel. When the old wheel was removed, the old nut came off with it. The new nut was already in place on the new wheel. This system is still in use today. In the later years, Formula One found clever methods to make sure wheel nuts stay in place and don't come loose. For example, Honda's wheel nut design from 2006 was quite innovative. It was lightweight, had a special shape that made it easy to fit with a socket, and had small holes to prevent it from coming off during a race. However, some other teams like Red Bull continued to use a different system called the hex system until 2008. It's interesting to note that sometimes the simplest ideas are the most effective. Even today, many racing teams in categories like GT3 or Prototype still use wheel nuts similar to Honda's design. They often buy these wheel nuts from third-party suppliers. In 2009, some interesting changes occurred in Formula One. They began experimenting with how the wheels affect the car's movement through the air, and even the wheel nut became part of this aerodynamic exploration. Back in 2006, Ferrari tinkered with special covers attached to the wheel, featuring a hole to access the wheel nut. However, these covers were labeled as movable aerodynamic parts and were consequently prohibited. Ferrari found a solution in 2009 by making these covers fixed and legally acceptable. Though technically integrated into the braking duct system, they were essentially built into the wheel nut. This innovation helped engineers reduce air resistance, enabling cars to go faster. A cool aspect was that the wheel nut spun alongside the wheel. To hold it steady, the cover engaged with the stationary part within the axle. Teams improved aerodynamics and downforce by refining the cover design and attaching it with wheel nuts for pit stops. Clear covers on wheel guns helped. Unfortunately, these innovations got banned next season, needing new strategies. In 2010, Formula One underwent a significant change. Refueling during races was banned, reshaping the dynamics of the sport. Pit stops are now centered around changing tires exclusively. This transition put the spotlight on wheel nuts, revealing a challenge with the hexagonal nuts in use. Hex nuts have 8 possible correct orientations, increasing the chances of mistakes during pit stops. Teams addressed the problem with better wheel nuts. Mercedes' 2011 nut had 12 splines for flexible alignment, while Ferrari's coarser thread sped up pit stops. Identifying left and right side nuts became easier as Ferrari color-coded them, red for right and green for left. A spring-loaded circular clip secures the nuts within the wheel, meeting regulations that prevent nuts from fully detaching if they come loose. As mechanics engage the wheel gun, the spring compresses, and upon fitting, it springs out, offering a visual indicator of proper tightening. This mechanism continues to evolve in modern F1 cars. In 2010, despite teams' efforts to improve, there were ongoing problems with wheel nuts coming loose during races, especially shortly after pit stops. Even though systems were being adjusted, a pit stop taking just 3 or 4 seconds was still considered quite long, leaving less room for mistakes. A breakthrough came when teams began experimenting with blown axles, a smart concept that utilized air from the brake duct system to pass through the axle, enhancing tire performance and aerodynamics. An idea pushed turbulent tire air away, increasing downforce and cooling, though less efficiently due to drag. Williams' 2013 blown wheel nuts boosted performance with a bigger front nut enhancing airflow. However, there were challenges, as seen with Bottas in Monaco. The design had downsides, particularly related to the number of splines on the wheel nut. More splines meant improved engagement but a weaker structure. In Monaco, a pit stop mishap resulted from the socket not fully engaging before the wheel gun was activated, causing the socket to shear off the splines of the nut. By 2023, wheel nuts have somewhat shared among teams, categorized as a part open to development, but with information sharing to prevent excessive costs. This approach enables teams to adopt revolutionary wheel nut ideas without engaging in costly development battles. The wheels themselves are now uniform across all cars, supplied by BBS. Now, let's delve into the cost. Crafted from lightweight yet less durable aluminum, these intricate wheel nuts are often machined in-house, adding to the expense. The meticulous F1 standards require them to be X-rayed for cracks and anodized for enhanced wear resistance and coloring. The estimated cost for each wheel nut ranges from £800 to £1,000. Compounding this expense is the fact that aluminum isn't highly wear resistant, prompting teams to use a fresh wheel nut for every wheel. With 13 sets of tires allocated per race car per weekend, the costs for wheel nuts alone can exceed £50,000 per car. While some might be reused or remachined, the expenditure remains remarkable. Do you believe these advancements are worth this cost? Share your point of view in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Until next time, stay curious and enjoy.